So this is actually the second time Arcturix have approached me to talk about comfort in uncomfortable places. And although I promised the team I wouldn't just repeat the same talk as last time, I've been pretty static for the last year, I'd say now. And so it's going to be slightly different, but there's going to be some pretty key elements that are quite similar. So I'm going to start off with a story. It was in January last year. My friend Stefan and I had been in Iceland for about 3 weeks at this point. We'd started skiing up this valley just south of Akureyri called Eyjafjörður. Excuse me if I get any of the Icelandic names wrong. But basically it's due south of the town, and it is the last step before reaching this highland expanse that we called the plateau. In summer it's called the interior, but effectively it's just this really, really flat expanse of white, all the way from where you are to the horizon, which we were just gunning for, because this valley at the moment was just torture for us. There was a little river running between these two steep sides, and we were kind of traversing one of the sides, the river down to our left, and it was always a bit hairy as to whether or not we were on snow or slush, or whether or not the snow we were on was going to give way, because there was like little streams running underneath it. And basically we didn't want to be anywhere near that valley. So we looked on the map and we saw that there was this like little highland road which zigzagged across the mountain on the right hand side. And we thought, right, if we can get ourselves and our pulks up onto the top of this valley side, then it means that we then are at the height of the plateau, and so there's not much undulation from there to get to this flat section. And so we pitched the tent for the evening in this valley and thought, right, we need to get high. We're not going to try and navigate the valley anymore. We're gonna try and ascend quickly. Now, that's tricky, because between us we were hauling 4 pulks. They're like these plastic sledges which store all your food or your tents or your equipment that you're going to need for the duration of the trip. And those 4 pulks probably weighed about 200 kilograms together. So it's about 100 kilograms each, and then let's say like 60 kilograms in mine, and then 40 in the one behind it, and then Steph's got the same sort of thing. Problem is that that's a lot of weight, and it's really cumbersome. And any changes in course or direction or momentum even means that you are effectively having to build up, get past that inertia every single time. And then going uphill, you're always losing that inertia because you've also then got the weight of it being dragged down. I've got a clip of it here actually, which I'll put on screen now.
Not easy, huh?
Not easy. 200 fucking kilograms of not easy.
And so after we dragged the pulks up a little bit, we developed this system of dragging one pulk up about 100 meters, unclipping the pulk from our harness, skiing back down 100 meters, grabbing the next pulk, and then dragging that pulk back up again. And we argued about which one was going to be better. Is it easier to drag the heavier pulk up first, because then you've got a track, or is it easier to drag the heavier pulk up second, but then you're more knackered? And we never came to a conclusion, because you never would. But that was the system: one pulk up, unclip, ski down, clip, one pulk, last pulk up again. We probably did this about 40 times throughout the day, and we only reached what we'd say is about halfway, and it was torrid. It was horrible. I wouldn't wish it on a lot of people. For better or for worse, I was just knackered. It was a long, hard day. Visibility was a bit naff. You're not talking to each other because you're always missing each other, and it's just one of the most unenjoyable parts of this sort of trip. But anyway, that evening we navigated these massive frozen boulders that are on the side of this cliff face as you kind of start looping around on this path. We managed to find a relatively decent area with no boulders. It was quite flat. It was quite unexposed as well because there was quite high banks on either side, and it was almost like an ideal campsite. And we look to our north, and we see this beautiful glow of Acuary up the valley. It was about 50k away, so it was a fair way away, but it was stunning to see the stars in the sky and then this beautiful, like, light polluted glow coming up. It made you feel like you were back in civilization for a short glimpse. And now, when Steph and I do these trips, we have this ability to almost act before we need to talk. And so we can set up a camp, and we can kind of judge what the other person's about to do next without really needing to communicate. And so when we got to the campsite, we both finished pulling our second pulk in. We took a deep breath, and we knew, right, we need to start building camp now, because if we don't start building camp immediately, we're going to get cold, and we don't want to get cold, because then it's a whole world of issues. We want to get the tent up, get in the sleeping bag, get the food on, and get to bed. And so in this unspoken fashion that we'd kind of developed, we'd blitzed setting up camp that evening. I mean, we were probably in the tent in about 10 minutes. Steph was in a sleeping bag, I was cooking dinner, and we really felt good about ourselves, having, you know what, we've done a really hard shift today, and now we're in the tent and we're ready to get some sleep. And we came up with another system, which is something that I'll come back to later. But we came up with this other system where I did the dinners, Steph did the breakfasts. It meant that Steph got a bit of an earlier night, and it meant that I got to lie in, because in the mornings I was useless, and in the evenings he then got an extra hour or so's kit while he was having his dinner. And so we'd set up the tent, thrown our sleeping kit in the door, started our chores like lighting the stoves, melting water, and thinking about being warm again. For dinner, I think I had my favourite actually that night. It was the chicken tikka masala with rice and Tabasco. Anyway, as he was lying there, he unexpectedly fell silent in the sleeping bag next to me. And it's kind of hard to tell when someone's going quiet in the sleeping bag in the tent, because the stoves are loud, and so any kind of rustle or noise is usually just completely eclipsed by the fact that there's this roaring stove. But that evening I kind of listened up, and I heard, okay, this is unusually quiet. Usually there's some chat or there's some banter in the tent, or one of us is asking what podcast it's going to be for that evening. But this was eerie. So I didn't really want to say anything, because I thought if he's thinking through stuff, he needs some space and some time, and it's really difficult sometimes to actually manufacture that space and time for yourself when you're on these trips, because there's always something going through your head, or you're always next to each other. So sometimes it's nice to just give a bit of space. And about 30 seconds into me overthinking this, Steph pipes up and he goes, "Mate, I can hear a car." Now, although we could see the lights from Acuary, we were at least 40k away from the city, even from the outskirts of the city. We were probably about 10, 12k from the nearest track, and even that was completely covered in snow. And so the chance that he could hear a car was so slim. So my reaction to that was, "Mate, you're going insane. Would you like me to say anything to your family before you finally kick the bucket?" And after a sly like smirk through the sleeping bag, he goes, "No, seriously, mate, I can genuinely hear a car, and it's really close." And at this point, I'm still deafened by the roaring stove that I'm attending to, and didn't really want to think much more of it, because I thought, like, it can't be a car. There's just no way on earth that it's a car. So my kind of reaction was, "Right, mate, let me know if it gets any closer, and then we can investigate." Just trying to pass the buck, really. Anyway, after about half an hour and some top quality chicken tikka masala and Tabasco, managed to get my head down on the pillow, and sure enough, there it was, the hum of a car engine, which you could only hear when everything was absolutely silent. It's about a minute later, after verifying it in my own head 3 or 4 times, I said, "Mate, so what if we could hear a car?" it couldn't be anywhere near here, could it? And so, for the next 10 minutes, Steph and I just started going through scenarios in our heads as to, well, what if it's someone that's driven off the road? Or what if it's someone on the plateau that we can hear coming over the valley? Or what if there's a road that we don't know about near here? And I thought, well, that's got to be the only option, that there is a drivable, passable road within earshot of us in the tent. And if there was, it really makes us question our decisions as to why we're dragging 200 kilograms worth of kit up the side of this blooming mountain. Not one to leave any stone unturned. I checked the GPS, and sure enough, right beneath us on our location was a really thin blue line indicating a stream. And it became very apparent that we'd actually camped and set up tent on a glacial river that wasn't quite frozen. Now, luckily, unlike the story, we didn't break the ice. However, it did immediately make us realise the precariousness of our situation. When you go into autopilot and you just let things carry on without intervention, sometimes you can really miss glaringly obvious signs and things can go really badly wrong. And that's what I really want to talk about in this webinar, is the signs of things going wrong before they do. Now, it's a difficult topic to get your head around, discomfort, because it's seemingly so subjective and personal, what makes people uncomfortable, that is. But on the whole, I think it's almost quite objective too, because ignoring social situations or contextual situations, discomfort, in at least environmental discomfort, comes down to the lack of three things. It's food, shelter, or warmth. And if you don't have those three things, either presently or in the near future, then you'll notice that comfort starts to decrease. And it's those signs that I want to talk about today. It's the signs that comfort is slowly starting to wear thin, so to speak. So that brings me to the title, I guess. It's the root of the problem. And the root of the problem for comfort, at least in uncomfortable situations, for me, isn't the cause of the discomfort per se. It's the beginnings of the development of uncomfortableness or discomfort. Because when we're in an expedition environment, it's quite easy to track discomfort within ourselves. Most people that have been in an environment where they're feeling challenged will know that they start kicking in this mindset of checking fingers, checking toes. They'll slowly start wiggling their fingers inside their gloves, or they'll slowly start wiggling their toes just to check on the cold. Or, for example, they'll start thinking, oh, I wonder if I'm too warm, if I'm too wet. And then once you then get into a process of doing that, you start going around in loops. You start thinking, okay, well, how are my hands doing? How are my feet doing? How are my shoulders doing? Am I sweating too much? Am I too cold? Do I need to unvent? And you start asking these small questions that accumulate to give you almost like a full body checkup. And that's kind of how a lot of people will track that discomfort in these environments. But then what about when it's not you? What about when it's not you checking on yourself? And that brings me back to another story. So Steph and I have reached the plateau. It's this expanse of white as far as the eye can see, and we actually got to the top of this plateau on Christmas Day, I think it was, and we are greeted with this stunning horizon of orange. I mean, this thing was otherworldly. The sun had just clipped the horizon directly south of us, but because of how far north we were and it was the middle of winter, the sun only does a really shallow arc on the horizon, and so you've got this really short time frame of being able to catch the sun. And I distinctly remember that day, it brought a tear to my eye. I had to stop skiing and take a knee just because it was the first time we'd seen the sun in like 3 weeks, and it was what we needed after hauling 200 kilograms worth of kit halfway up a mountain. It was probably the best Christmas present I could have asked for. But the beautiful thing was that because there was not a cloud in the sky, and this orange glow was just filling the horizon, and it was so far in the distance, we could see absolutely every hill that we had to cross from where we were to 10 days ahead of us, because the plateau where we were was just set higher than where we were in the distance. And so we could effectively map out our entire route, something that I've never been able to do before on any of these trips, where you can almost see the exact direction and every obstacle that you think you're going to face. And so we set off from the top of the plateau south. And we know that there's a couple of key checkpoints that we need to hit along the way in order to make sure that we're on the right track and make sure that we're hitting the road at the right time, and effectively just make sure that everything's going to plan. We want to hit these certain milestones. The next day, after we'd camped up and we'd set off again, I turned around to Steph about 4 hours before we were meant to stop skiing and say, mate, I am out, I'm done, I'm cooked. I need to just chill out and not ski. I need to just get my head out of the game. I don't know whether or not it was me being psyched out. I don't know whether or not it was me feeling rattled or whatever. But I needed to just tap out for the day. And we were well short of our mileage that day. But testament to the support that Steph gives me, he immediately, as soon as he saw the look on my face before I even said the words, you could see him nodding, being like, yeah, fine, mate, whatever, we'll stop skiing today, we'll set the tent up. At one point, he turned around and was like, if we just go an extra 20 minutes, we'll go... And you could see halfway through his sentence, it was just, yeah, you're not going anywhere. And honestly, I think that was one of the key things that helped me in these places, is knowing that there's someone that can read you like a book standing next to you as you're skiing. Anyway, we stopped for the day and we packed at the tent. The light had just dimmed. It was this perfect blue hour, which is just constant. There's this like Arctic blue just filling the horizon, and the wind was non-existent. We checked the weather and there was meant to be no big storms, anything hitting that evening. To be honest, if you're looking back at it, it would have been the perfect time to keep skiing. It would have been absolutely ideal. So much so that we didn't even bother building a snow wall. We just tipped the pulks on their side and hoped that they'd be fine, and they were. It was that perfect conditions, but at that time I was just slammed. So that evening I made dinner, the normal routine. I made dinner, Steph had a couple of hours kip, and then in breakfast he makes it, and then I start packing up the tent and we set off the next morning. And we have this system where Steph tends to be quicker than me on the mountains, and I tend to be quicker than him on the flat. And so we go through these cycles of Steph's overtaking me, and then 3 hours later when it flattens out, I then start overtaking him. And we go through this kind of yo-yo game. There's no real strict rules of, right, you're up front now, you're up front now. It kind of just works itself out. Anyway, we're going up this hill, and I see Steph stops. He's probably about 150, 200 metres ahead of me. Visibility was fine at the time. Wasn't great, but it was fine. And he's circled back on himself about 2 metres, the length of the rope that attaches you to your pulk. Sat on his pulk and waited for me, and I could see him getting his thermos out, getting the cheese out, and getting the biltong out. So I ski up next to him, just past him, circle around, sit on the pulk. And immediately, there's something wrong with the vibe. There's something different. And he hits me with something that I didn't expect to ever hear from him, which was, I'm just really, really finding it hard not to think. And that hits like a bit of a gut punch when your best mate says, I'm trying hard not to think. Because in that environment, you're always thinking about your toes or your fingers or your sweat or your cold or what's exposed and what's not exposed. And so when he says, I'm trying really hard not to think, it becomes really difficult to then not think about what he's trying not to think about. And we end up moving off from lunch. We've only really touched on it because you definitely got the understanding that that was something you didn't want to be interrogated about. And so we ski on. I start overtaking Steph, and do this yo-yoing for a while until I pull away on the flat. And it comes to about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the sun's gone down, it's all dark, and it's a bit miserable. Steph then comes up behind me, and every now and then when you're tired or you got something on your mind, your voice changes. It might go soft, or it cracks, or there's just something that you can pick up on. And that was one of them, where he came up and was like, so what's for lunch? And it wasn't anything big or intense or even noticeable, but it was definitely something that you could hear. That something wasn't quite right. And it's really difficult to read a face when you're completely covered in masks and balaclavas and whatnot. And so you've really got to rely on everything else, like hearing or vibe. And that was like strike 2 in my head of, okay, are we gonna talk about this? We'd skied for about another hour, and I said to him, mate, there's a hut quite close to us, probably about 2k away. It wasn't on the GPS device, it was only on a paper map that I'd brought with us, an old paper map that I brought with us. And he turned around, and without really saying anything, it was just a nod. And so that was then strike 3 to me, of saying, right, this is something that we need to talk about, and we need to address this because there's something not quite right here. And so we skied to the hut. I say we skied to the hut. Steph marched to the hut ahead of us. So much so that he went there, dropped his 2 pulks off at the hut, skied back, grabbed my second pulk, just to be able to get us to the hut quicker. We get our way into the corridor of the hut, which is something they do in Iceland. They leave the foyers of the huts open for people like us who are in the middle, who potentially need to get in because of storms, or people that are in there in winter, for example. There's just some sort of shelter. Once we get in the hut fully, we start getting warmed up and we manage to get some food on. Then we start talking about what's going through his head. And basically, he said that the physical is absolutely fine. He's just struggling with the mental aspects of the trip because he didn't really realise how torrid it was going to be again. And there was no indication in him that he wanted to stop at that point because he knew he was completely capable of it. We called it a night that night, and I remember writing in my daily notebook, something's up, there's an issue, there's a problem, we need to figure it out because it could be bad. We set off from the hut the next day, and it is terrible visibility. It's one of those days where it is just completely white in front of you. It's like people call a blizzard like inside the ping pong ball. This is more like being in a wind tunnel with a plastic bag over your head. There's just no sense of up or down or left or right. In fact, I'll show you a photo. There's a signpost in this image. Yeah, that should give you an indication of what the visibility was like that day. we're skiing, and we know we've got a shift to do that day because of my error 2 days before where I'd stopped skiing earlier. We had something like 26k to do that day, which is a lot to do in the dark as well. And so we knew that there was a big day ahead of us. The visibility was terrible. It wasn't windy as such at that time, but we knew that it wasn't going to be fun. And so we started skiing, and we do the yo-yoing normally until the visibility gets really bad, and then when the visibility gets really bad, we stand next to each other, effectively just skiing side by side. And I know that a lot of people sometimes go one by one, but the morale of having each other standing next to each other at that point was more important to us than being front and back and whatnot. Which, especially considering what we picked up on the day before with Steph, it was definitely less isolating. And so we get to this point where Steph's ahead of me, and I can see him, and you could see because of his skis that he was on like a slope like this, and he's there, and I ski in next to him, just here, and I feel my pulk on my ropes just slide in next to me. I thought, okay, that's fine. Usually they just kind of slide and then it stops. And then I felt the other pulk just slide in quicker than the first pulk, and then just disappear off into the fog over there. And then with almost comic timing, I glance at Steph, and he looks at me, and there's the split second of shit. Off goes my pulk, off goes the second pulk, and then the harnesses that we're wearing here and back just yanks me backwards into this void of white, and no idea where everything's gone. Steph is shouting like, mate, and I have no idea what's happening. I've been yanked off my feet by my chest, effectively. Next thing I know, Steph has found me, and I'm upside down, head first in this snowdrift. It turns out, because the visibility was so bad, I didn't see that I'd skied up onto this lip, which had about a 4-meter drop here. And my pulks had just gone shot off, and then the weight of the 100-kilogram pulks had completely taken me off my feet. Steph comes down, clears me off of the snow, is like, "You alright, mate? Everything okay?" And I was like, "Yeah, absolutely fine." Completely wigged out and just really shaken, but absolutely fine. Nothing's injured, nothing's wrong at all. We get into the tent that evening, turn on our sat phone and our phones and whatnot to try and get back into contact with everyone, and a absolute shitstorm of communication has gone on whilst we were skiing about our day after that incident. So it turns out that I had inadvertently smacked the spot tracker in my pocket of my ski trousers whilst mid-air being dragged by the pulks. And what I'd done is I'd pressed the button while smacking, saying, if we don't get back in contact in the next hour, then please try and get in contact with us. The problem is we didn't know we'd hit the spot tracker. And so at home we now have family, friends, the ops team, some of the search and rescue guys in Iceland, all on this, what's going on, where are they? And now, luckily, we'd been talking to the right people, and our friend, who was in charge of effectively watching us in Iceland, had been in contact with the families and the friends and the ops team, basically saying the area that they're in doesn't seem too dangerous. It looks like they're still moving. I wouldn't be worried. It's probably just an inadvertent press of the button. And that only came from the experience of the people that are out there, who are just indefinitely, they know this place incredibly well. And they know us quite well as well now. And that whole incident showed us that it's really, really important to at least have people that know where you are, what you're doing, and the ability that you have, even if it's not directly for you, but to help temper the discomfort of the people that are watching you. And so we then get to the next day, after we'd woken up and managed to calm everyone at home down. And again, we're back inside the plastic bag in the wind tunnel. It is just one of the worst whiteouts I've ever seen. You just couldn't see anything, and I mean anything. I mean, you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. I'm not exaggerating too much when I get to that. We were shoulder to shoulder the entire time, so we could literally reach out and grab each other, just for the worry if one of us got lost. It was that. Numbing. In those days, it really is a case of just putting the GPS out in front of you, getting the compass to make sure that they align, and then really just following bearings of saying, right, that's the direction I'm going for this many meters. That's the direction I'm going for this many meters. And in those environments, Steph trusts me to do the GPS and the nav. It gets to about 4 PM, and we are just fed up of not being able to see anything. The only indication of what land we're going over, whether it's up or down or there's rocks or it's deep snow or soft snow, is just from the feeling we're getting through the tips of our skis. It is sensory deprivation with the added danger of freezing. We made our way through 22 kilometers, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and we're skiing straight. It gets to the point when we can start feeling the land underneath us just slightly changing. It's almost like we're going around a traverse of a hill rather than going flat over them, which we have been doing. And the wind feels like it's slightly changing as well. And that's a big indicator to us when we're not looking at the GPS that we're moving, because usually the wind's quite consistent in one direction, so we can kind of follow that if the wind's always hitting you on this face. We start skiing, and we feel the wind change from here right the way around our heads and then go back to here over the course of about 5 minutes. We get into the tent that evening after this horrible day in this whiteout, and we both look at each other and we kind of like to recap everything from the day, because not only does it give us something to talk about, but it also allows us to take stock of everything. And we get into this conversation about that specific time, and we're like, mate, check the GPS. How many loop-de-loops did we do today? And so before we checked the GPS, I turned around to him and said, how many do you think we did? Just to try and see if we'd both mutually experienced this phenomenon. We both said 3 times, and we both said about 240. And so we were convinced that we'd done 3 circles, which is really possible because one leg's stronger than the other, and you're only really following the person next to you, and if you're both following each other, then it's a whole thing. We were convinced that we'd done 3 loop-de-loops. You look on the GPS was on the entire time, at least at that point, and we hadn't done 1. But that evening, that freaked us both out, because we'd managed to do this entire shared anomaly of, we've gone around in circles. After taking stock of everything, from me needing to just take a break after going up onto the plateau, up Airfield Valley, Steph needing to slow down and get to the hut, me falling off the wind lip, and then this whiteout that hit us completely out of nowhere, and caused us to do this loop-de-loop, or the series of loop, or potentially loop-de-loops that didn't actually happen, which is the worrying thing. It came to the point where we just said, you know what, we need to just take a day and just take a day to chill, really. And so we woke up the next morning, and it was the best conditions we have ever seen. ever in that location. Blue skies. It was about -7, so it was a really nice hard packed layer of snow and ice underneath us. All the wind, snowdrift had been completely taken away, so we had a really nice glide on the skis, and we could see from our location all the way to the foot of Tungsnefellsjökull, which is where we were heading to a series of huts called Niadala. And basically we had the whole day to just get there. We had to ski, I think it was 24 miles that day, so it was a fair old ski, but it was the best opportunity for us to get there. And it was mainly flat, and that's really important, because this entire day I could not keep up with Steph at all. And I tried hard, like I tried to keep up with him, get in front of him to try and gauge how quickly he was going, but every single time he just ran the outside. Whatever had come over him, he was blitzing that day, like properly blitzing that day. And to give you an idea of how quickly I was skiing, I was pretty certain let's put it this way, by the time we got to our destination, I was about 10 minutes late because I really needed the toilet. And I got straight to the huts at Niadala. Steph had gone into the hut, I'd grabbed the toilet paper, and I'd gone around the hut to try and find somewhere I can go and dig a nice little snow hole. And when I get back, the door's open to the hut, which usually is a 2-man job. Steph's ski boots are on the floor, his socks are on the floor, and he's in the next room, just silent. And immediately I knew that is not right. There's no something has not gone to plan here, and we needed to do something about it. First thing we did, stoves on, get some tea going, get some warmth going. Second thing, sleeping bag. I'd unpacked his, unpacked mine, wrapped him in both, and then it was just a case of trying to see what had happened. It turns out that he'd very, very slowly been putting off a lot of anxiety over the last 4 or 5 days, and it all kind of come to a head as we reached Niadala. And for better or for worse, I'm in admiration of the guy for saying it, because he just turned around to me and was like, mate, I've hit my limit, I'm done. Not physically, I could see that physically he was okay, but he just hit his point and he couldn't carry on. Now that leaves us in a really awkward situation, because we are currently the most isolated people in the country, and it's a very difficult place to get out of if you're not going to get out of it yourself. And so we're in this hut, and we've made the decision that we're not going to carry on. It would be unwise of me to drag Steph out of the hut at this point in the state that he was in, and it'd be foolish to try and turn around in the same vein, because we were about equal distance away from civilization north as we were south. And so we called on Plan B, which was a friend of ours called Gester, who had offered to drive out to the interior in the middle of winter with a group of his mates in their super jeeps to come and see if they could pick us up. Long story short, it took 4 days for them to muster the team, get the cars together, and they ended up falling short by about 27k. And now 27k isn't actually that far normally, but they had about 4 or 5 hours before they were going to turn around and go home. And so we were in a position in this hut where we had the choice. We either can ski 27k from the hut to Gester and the team, and to cover that sort of distance we'd have to jettison the kit and effectively just beeline straight to the vehicles, or we don't, and they have to turn around. We made some rules in the hut that every phone call that gets into the hut, considering our relatively isolated nature, had to be on loudspeaker, so we could actually talk and know that we were both working for each other and with each other. And the decision was made that we weren't going to risk it, because in those 4 or 5 hours of us trying to ski the 27 kilometers, if we were to get hit by a storm, or an ankle were to be twisted, or something were to go wrong, we'd be left with nothing, and the cars wouldn't be able to get to us even 4 kilometers ahead of their position rather than 27. And so the decision was made that those guys would turn around, which then pulled into action Plan C, which was to talk to another set of friends to get a heli to come and pick us up from the centre of Iceland. We called the heli pilots and basically said to them, guys, this is the situation. If you guys can get to us soon, that would be fantastic. Otherwise, there's a storm coming on Monday. I think it was like 2 days away, which would mean that we'd be stuck in the hut for another 4 or 5 days, which wouldn't be the worst thing, but obviously wasn't ideal considering Steph's deteriorating state. And immediately they dispatched the heli, and then they were with us about an hour and a half later, and then we were on a flight back to Reykjavik before I even had a chance to take stock of what had happened. And now, why am I telling you about the story about this attempt at trying to cross Iceland again? Well, I think it comes down to the root of the problem, which I wholeheartedly realise I could have dealt with better on that journey. There were various incidents that I've talked about so far which I look back on and think I wish I'd have done something different in those scenarios. And there weren't things at the time that I think I would have done differently, but looking back I know that I should do better next time. Whether it's climbing the valley and camping on the ice river, or having to tap out half a day early on our first day on the plateau, or having not addressed the conversation with Steph about what was on his mind for the days preceding the storms, or whether or not it was not just being more open about route and nav in the storm, in the low visibility. There were certain things that I think would have been, I'm not even going to say that they would have helped, but they would have been better to have dealt with differently. And that's why I think I'm talking about the root of the problem today, because it's so important to address issues that crop up in these environments immediately when you're dealing with it yourself, that sometimes you then don't address when you think something's wrong with someone else, because sometimes it's easier to think about giving them space or giving people time, when sometimes all they need is just to talk something through. That trip has taught me that sometimes it's not just about the effort that you can put in physically, it's also about the attainment and the ambition and the drive that you have mentally. And they should be treated in the same way as your fingers or your toes, or the water seeping through your waterproofs, or sweat building up on your base layers, because these journeys are an amalgamation of trying to make sure that the things that go wrong aren't bigger than the things that go right, and without taking stock of all of the things that could go wrong, from the physical, the food, fuel, and warmth, so food, shelter, and warmth, to the mental, morale, ambition, cohesiveness. And so I think I'm trying to leave this webinar on a point of, this is what I do next. I learned a lot from that journey, not specifically just about how to stay comfortable in an uncomfortable place, but how and why it's so vitally important to address the root of the problem before it becomes a problem. The next time I go into this sort of environment, I'll have that kit with me to try and fix and notice any any of these issues arising. But I equally know that without having a couple of bad experiences, it's very difficult to have good experience. And so I don't see it as a failure in any way, shape or form. I see it as a learning curve, and I think the biggest thing about trying to be comfortable in an uncomfortable place is to listen to the learning curves, really. It's to make sure you're learning from when you have a bad time and make sure that you have a better time next time. Because if you don't, then you're just setting yourself up for failure again and again and again. I'd like to say thanks for listening to the webinar. It's been a pleasure to make, and it's been pretty fantastic to be able to relive a lot of the memories that I've had from some really incredible journeys whilst thinking about this trip. And it's been great having to listen back to my own advice as well. Something that I think is one of the key parts of being comfortable in an uncomfortable place is actually listening to yourself and the things that you've learned on previous journeys. So I'd like to say thanks for listening, and I hope you've enjoyed some of my stories.